Well, blessings during this month of March as we're filming this. It's the month dedicated to St. Joseph. We've been blessed from our Holy Father, Pope Francis, to have a year dedicated to St. Joseph. And now we're one day away from entering into the novena of St. Joseph, knowing that March 19th is the real day of St. Joseph, and that's solemnity. And so what a great way to just really segue into this great month of March, but to think about the formation and the identity of our children, of our families. And, you know, when you think about it, at least for me, growing up, I was dying to go to a Michael Jackson concert. And my dad is like, Michael Jackson, you could tell he probably did not want me to go to the Michael Jackson concert. He said, okay, you can go, but you have to get the lyrics to a song and then write a report on it and give it to me. Oh my gosh, I don't remember what song I wrote, but when I looked at those lyrics, I was like, this is disgusting. So anyway, I wrote the thing and I gave it to him. And it turned out the actual concert ended up getting canceled because of vending mistakes or something like that. And my dad asked him afterwards, I said, why did you make me do that? He goes, well, it's okay if you would have gone to the concert. I just didn't want you to wear the glove. Formation has so much to do with us engaging our freedom, but at the same time, the structures of truth that God has given to us, especially those people who have entrusted us with our lives, like our parents and our church. And so it's so beautiful to be able to struggle sometimes within our culture, to be able to discover the truths of our faith at the same time without wearing the glove. In other words, it's good to be in the culture, but not of the culture. You look at Jesus's life and you realize his formation that he received in his human nature from his mom and his dad and from the beautiful biblical roots in which he was born into. And you can just recognize the great gift that we've been blessed with in our Catholic faith. And so to that end, we just offer up this prayer to St. Joseph. To you, O blessed Joseph, do we come in our afflictions, and having implored the help of your most holy spouse, we confidently invoke your patronage also. Through the charity which bound you to the Immaculate Virgin Mother of God, and through the paternal love with which you embraced the child Jesus, we humbly beg you graciously regard the inheritance of Jesus Christ, who has purchased by his blood with your power and strength to aid us in our necessities. O most watchful guardian of the Holy Family, defend the chosen children of Jesus Christ. O most loving Father, ward us from every contagion of error and untruth corrupting us. O most mighty protector, be kind to us from heaven, assist us in our struggle with the power of darkness. As once you rescued the child Jesus from the deadly peril, so now, protector of God's holy church, from the snares of the enemy and from all adversity, shield us too. Guide us, love us, and protect us, O dear St. Joseph. And isn't it interesting to note St. Teresa of Avila, one of the great formators of all time, one of the great women who absolutely has impacted our church in so many ways with such a dear heart of a woman, being that genius for our culture, continually to inspiring us today. St. Teresa of Avila wrote, I do not remember even one time when I asked St. Joseph and he failed to grant me a blessing. To other saints, the Lord seems to have given the grace to help in our needs. But this glorious saint, in my experience, is the best of all of them. And so what a blessing it is to be able to welcome somebody who, in that genre of tremendous formators, the feminine heart and genius, and Dr. Teresa Farnan. Doctor, I appreciate you coming on the show today. And, you talked in one of your little bios about the role of like fides et ratio. And one of the phrases that seemed to be something that rings true in your heart is what St. John Paul II once said. With its enduring appeal to the search for truth, philosophy has a great responsibility of forming thought and culture. And now it must strive resolutely to recover its original vocation. I don't know if that's one of the mantras of your life or not, but Dr. Teresa Farnan is an author of 2 books at least. One is Get Out Now, Why You Should Pull Your Children from Public School Before It's Too Late, co-authored with dear Mary Rice Hassan. And another book is Where Did I Come From? Where Am I Going? How Do I Get There? Co-authored with Dr. Charles Rice. She's also the co-founder of a tremendous project, or the founder of a project called Person and Identity, which seeks to provide resources for families, for teachers, for institutions that want to really try to recognize the real identity of who we are in Christ, but also trying to understand and dialogue and offer the truth in the gender ideology confusion there is in the world. She's taught at St. Paul Seminary, Franciscan University, Mount St. Mary. She's worked with the diaconate formation program in different dioceses. She served as a consultant for the bishops, laity, marriage, family, and youth. She's a member of lots of advisory boards and councils. She gives lectures on gender ideology. She's also the sister-in-law of Father James Farnan. So if you know Father Farnan, this is his sister-in-law. She's obviously, just a tremendous intellect, and studied at Notre Dame, has a doctorate from there, and she's hosted programs on EWTN. The litany goes on. We could spend the whole time just speaking about that. However, I would suggest that the greatest thing that Dr. Farnan is, obviously she's a daughter of God, but the second would be that she's been married to Mike, and now they have 10 amazing children, of which what a blessing that is. Doctor, thanks for coming on the program.
Well, thank you. And I have to tell you, as I was listening to you recite the resume, at one point I was interviewed on EWTN, and a friend of mine who used to help, we would share babysitting, who's a stay-at-home dad. He was watching, and he said to my husband afterwards, all I could think was, that's the woman whose kids' socks never match. So just to put a little note of reality there are trade-offs. When you do things, I have to, the laundry sits on the couch, the dishes sit in the sink. So I'm not Superwoman, but I happen to be married to a very supportive and wonderful husband, and my kids are also very supportive.
Well, I feel the same way. I'm one of 8. My grandparents raised 13 kids, and being in a messy family is part of life.
It is life.
It's so beautiful.
Yes.
I remember that one scene of Mel Gibson where, Jesus is trying to make the table, and it seemed like it's not fitting what Mary was hoping for. And, he splashes water on her, and just, that's what life is. It's not perfect.
Right.
If it's not perfect, that means that's where we're supposed to be.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And my mother always said, my mother was just very, very devoted to her kids. She always said to me, your first priority is to your children. Everything else you do after that is, if you get it done, great, but your kids have to come first.
So where did you grow up?
I grew up in South Bend. I grew up in the shadow of the Golden Dome. My dad was a law professor at the University of Notre Dame, and there were 10 of us. So I grew up in a big, Irish Catholic, messy, chaotically enmeshed Catholic family, and I'm still incredibly close to my brothers and sisters. My sister is my collaborator on the Person and Identity Project. So, and my father was a tremendous influence on me. So I can recall, speaking to
What was your dad's name?
Charles Rice. So he was professor of law at the University of Notre Dame, and he was really I think I can say quite fairly, he was kind of a giant in the pro-life movement.
Absolutely.
One of the first to articulate the dangers of the secular state and where it was heading. And he really was a visionary. He was talking about marriage redefinition back when people were scoffing at the idea. He was talking about the problems of how the contraceptive culture was leading us into all of this. He was probably talking about the power of the ever-encroaching state and parents' rights, and how the pro-life movement really needed to pay attention to euthanasia and end-of-life issues, a lot of the things that we're seeing right now. But the one thing I remember about my dad is that he would show up. He showed up. He would show up at sports events. He would sit on the top row of a bleacher, and he would bring his work because he was constantly working. But he would look up and watch you run. I was a track runner. He would watch me run and make a sarcastic comment as I went by him, and I would start laughing. And that was the routine. It was lovely, actually. And he was very proud of his kids, but he was proud of us for the right reasons. And I think it was gave you a lot of confidence. The role of fathers is so underappreciated.
Yeah, what would you say were some of the formative aspects of your dad? Obviously, you just said something extremely important. He was present. He was present. I've always felt as a priest, which I'm called a father, 80% of my ministry is just to show up.
Yes. And that's so underappreciated. Absolutely. He was present. He spoke to his kids as adults. So we would be sitting around the dinner table and we would have conversations. And I don't want to give anyone the wrong idea. We had plenty of banter, plenty of, discussion of the logistics of the day. But in between, my dad would be teaching. So, well, that wouldn't be right because, and then he would go into a discourse on material and, cooperation and whether or not something was remote. And so you would pick up these things just from sitting around the dinner table. It was incredibly formative. So he was constantly teaching, but in a way that was conversational. So you felt like you were part of the project. And he also really led by example. And as a child, you wanted to go along with, like, I wanted to go along with my dad when he would do things, right? So if you went to mass with him on Saturday morning, you would get to go for donuts afterwards, right? And it wasn't just with religious things. He would go work out, run laps over at Notre Dame on the track. And if you went with him, you got a milkshake on the way home. So there were all these little built-in incentives. And really what you treasured was the time with him, but he always tried to make it slightly special. We never had a lot of money. My dad was famous for one time in the 1970s when gases were high and he came to him for kids. Somebody called about a bill and he told them he was on the try payment plan, and they said, we're not familiar with that. And he said, well, you make a payment and try to make another one. And that went down into family legend. So you learn to approach life with humor, and that we would get through somehow. My parents had the phrase large family financing, which meant sometimes you would, borrow from this person or that person to buy this or that, and it would all even out in the end. So it was
when you talk like that, it makes me feel that sometimes people can think that, well, because I don't have all the funds, then I can't do the formation for my children.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
And that seems to not be what your parents felt.
No. And formation is less about buying a program than it is about being with a child and being attentive day to day and being able to answer the question when it comes up. Being able to bring them along on activities. And if you pay attention to your own formation and include your child as a partner, then I think you're going to find that it's far more successful than to try to impose a program on your children.
Yeah, John Paul II would say it's not about imposing, it's about proposing.
Correct.
Talk about your mom. What role did she play in terms of being able to compliment your dad, or being able to, I don't know if sometimes she felt like a referee or what, but raising 10 kids could not have been a simple project.
No, it wasn't. And my dad traveled a lot because
Right.
he would try to supplement his income with speaking. He was really in demand. He would go wherever he was asked to go, right? And so that meant he was on the road a lot. And so a lot of the care of children, the ordinary care, driving kids around, fell to my mom, and she never complained. She did not complain. She viewed herself as a partner in the enterprise. She would sit down, she would read his, when he was writing a book, she was his editor. She would proofread. She would give him reaction. Now, my enduring image of my mother is at 10 o'clock in the morning, when most people are cleaning up the house, she would pour herself a cup of coffee and light a cigarette and sit down with the New York Times.
Oh,
right?
I love this.
So
this is
she
great.
just,
yeah, awesome.
she had her own rhythm and her own tempo, and it was really good as a young girl growing up to say, okay, she's not just a housewife. She has a mind of her own, and she's engaged in things. And she saw that as important because she was the sounding board for my dad. And so she stayed fully engaged with things. So they were a funny couple. They were a very, very funny couple. She was fiercely devoted to her children. And she really, the other funny anecdote is at one point, my mom accompanied my dad on one of the trips that he took, and a woman in the audience stood up and started, in one of the story questions that people give, started accusing him of being patriarchal and of oppressing his wife, who was home with 10 kids. And my mom stood up and gave her an earful and said, "You don't know me," and just gave her right back to her. So she was a real character, and I think from her, we learned again to approach life with humor and to put people first, and that there are going to be bumps on the road, along the way, and it isn't about money. Money is something that can help you do things, but the most important thing would be the people in your life.
Yeah, I find in a big family that the atmosphere of love, which has to do with both sometimes discipline and joy, is what really opens up a heart to receiving the formation of the parents. And it's so hard to do that, because I can imagine so many of the parents and grandparents watching, when kids are so enthralled by the latest thing on social media, and they get distracted and don't have a chance to be in that atmosphere. I remember growing up where family dinner, you never missed family dinner.
Yes.
And now I wonder, like on Sundays, okay, you can take the quote unquote obligation of Mass away, but we still have a duty towards the Lord to rest in the Lord and to be a family.
Yes.
And I can't imagine giving that over to public schools or to other people. And
Right.
your parents, despite the challenges, took the formation of their children as their number one mission as a married couple.
Right. And we had a family dinner every night.
Hmm.
And it didn't mean that everybody was there all the time,
Correct.
but you always knew it was there.
Mhm.
You knew there would be a family dinner. And so you would try to show up for it.
So you ended up staying in South Bend and went to school there as well.
I went to the University of Notre Dame, and that
Mhm.
was where I met my husband. So that was, you know.
So how'd you meet him?
happy. We met in Latin class, actually. So,
Latin
first day,
is not a romantic language.
it was the two of us and then a class full of priests and nuns. So.
I could imagine. Well, that's true. Then you guys really.
And we were great friends all through college. And then afterwards, you know, as my husband used to laugh and say, I couldn't have, you know, didn't want to date you in college because we would have been married as sophomores. So no, that was
Smart.
which I always thought was funny. And then we were married when he was in law school. And I
So
was
how
in
did he
graduate
propose
school.
to you?
That's the state secret. Our kids
Okay,
don't
sorry,
even
they don't even know. Well,
know.
All right, we'll leave it at that. I wouldn't want to.
It was.
You don't want to make a public announcement that you could show them this?
Oh no. But I will say this:
Yes.
it was far more private. You know, I look at the very public proposals now, and our generation wasn't quite so public, but you know, still very, very special and very important, and you know.
Without sounding trite, what would you say were the gifts and the talents? Because obviously you could spend your whole life talking about your dear husband. But what do you think you found in him that made you realize that this man is the one you want to form a family with and dedicate your life to loving and being a part of a married relationship with?
You know what? I recognized immediately that he was somebody who had a great capacity for sacrifice and a huge sense of responsibility. Very loyal, a great sense of humor, which is great because when you study philosophy, you take yourself too seriously, and he keeps me in the real world, right? Life is in our family. It's fun. It's unpredictable. But he is one of the hardest working people I know, and he loves his family, and he would give his life for it. So, you know, when you see that, you say to yourself, this is somebody who's truly is countercultural and just, you know, an amazing person.
What's it like to raise 10 children?
I think it's easier than raising one.
Really?
To be honest, yes.
Okay.
I mean, it can be a logistical challenge,
Okay.
right? The hardest part was when they were all in school and we were trying to go from one place to another. But in some ways, when you have more than one child, they amuse themselves. And when you only have one child, you as the parent are on all the time. So I have people who come up to me and say, I'm exhausted with one child, or I'm exhausted with two child. I can't imagine having 10. And I will say to them in all candor, I get it, because I was exhausted with one child and exhausted with two and could not imagine how I could have one more. But what you find as you have more children is that, you know, they suddenly have more people in their family. And so as the family expands, it takes pressure off of you as a parent to be all things to all people, right? Because then you've got the dynamic of siblings.
Yes,
So-
that's true. I don't know if you agree with this, but in families that I know, like mine and others, the jump from 2 to 3 was one of the hardest jumps. And then after that point, it was really, because you're not man-to-man defense anymore. You got to go zone.
You go zone. Exactly. That is exactly what my husband says all the time. And that is true. That is exactly right. And actually it was funny because once we crossed over from the first 4 or 5 people, people would give us a hard time, you know, the classic
in the restaurants,
comments.
the typical,
oh my
exactly.
goodness. And they all have the same stupid jokes, right? Like I've heard them a million times. But then what we found was after that, people would sort of expect us to announce we were having another child. And we started getting the "what's taking you so long" questions. Or when you would say, "Hey, I'm expecting again," everybody would say, "Great, we were wondering when you would have another one," right?
Yeah.
So there's somewhere around child number 6, everyone realizes you're completely crazy and countercultural, and they're all in. They're all supportive. Now you're one of those crazy big family people, and people find you eccentric but endearing, right? So somewhere you make that shift, but it's the 4 to 5 range where I think
that's what it was for you.
Yeah, people are still looking at you like, yeah, what's going on? Are these, what is your story? But once you have more than that, then I've had people follow me around. I've had people try to take my pictures. I had someone once who came up to me and said, I hear big families are coming back in style. And I was so tempted to say, that's me, slave to fashion. That's why I'm doing this.
That's hilarious.
What can you do?
Your youngest child is Annie, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And she has an extra chromosome.
She does.
Can you discuss what it's like to be able to treasure a little girl like that?
Oh, well, this is funny because I can remember when we first got the diagnosis. We went for an ultrasound, and the technician, she was our 10th, right? So we were pretty familiar with ultrasounds, and I was watching the technician measure her nose and the fold of her neck, and I said, I think I know what's going on. And so my husband walked out afterwards, and we looked at each other, and he said, I think in 20 years, we're going to be huggers at the Special Olympics. And I said, it's a great way to spend retirement, right? And, but the pregnancy was actually, it was emotionally, it was hard, not hard because I was worried about her. But I think when you're pregnant with a child with special needs, you really are tuned into the fact that most of the culture would not support your child, right? Most of the culture looks at your child as a burden. And I hated telling people that she was going to have Down syndrome because I would get people apologizing and telling me they were sorry. And I understand what they were thinking, right? In their mind, they were thinking, wow, there's some hardship that comes with this, and it's a medical condition. But on the other hand, when you're pregnant with a baby with Down syndrome, you can't help but feel like they're sorry that you're having that particular child. And it was interesting to see how everything, once she was born and people got to know her, how much it shifted. So that by the time she was a year old, I would go places and I was literally Annie's mom. I mean, I was at a football game one time and a perfect stranger came up to me. He was a gentleman who worked at one of the grocery stores, and he said, you're Annie's mom. And I'm looking at him thinking, I think you look familiar, but he was someone who recognized my daughter and got to know her because she just draws people in. She is really, truly just such a gift to the whole family. She's, everybody's favorite child, everyone's favorite sibling. She was remarkably easy. She had a very easygoing personality, hardly cried when she was a baby because she has some respiratory issues, so she doesn't have good breath support.
Right.
And it was funny, at some point, my husband remarked to me, he said, if we had her first, we would have thought there was something wrong with all the others. So she's just a joy. Still to this day is a delightful little girl. She just has a great capacity for love. And, we've decided her gift is that she brings out the best in everyone, because she truly does. I mean, just to see how people respond to her, she just elicits love and gives it right back. It is just a grace. And people in our culture don't know what they're missing. They do not know what they're missing. But again, I really saw a sea change once she was born and people got to know her. And now I think I would say unanimously in the schools, she's everybody's favorite Farnan.
Sure.
She's delightful. And it hasn't been easy from a medical standpoint. She did have some medical issues, but we're blessed here in Pittsburgh. We've got the Down syndrome community and the Down syndrome clinic at UPMC at Children's, and such tremendous support. So to anyone who knows anyone who's expecting a child with Down syndrome, I would just say, be not afraid. You are truly, when she was about 3 months old, I remember saying to the doctor at the Down syndrome clinic, I feel like I was given this great gift and no one believes it, right? Like here we got the brass ring and nobody recognizes it. But now they do. She's tremendous.
My dear cousin, Father Chris Donnelly, started it's called Brother Andre Cafe, and he's trying to offer employment to children with Down syndrome as they get a bit older, and there's this in-between space for some of them to be able to distribute coffee, make cookies, and then package them up and send them out. And obviously with Corona, we haven't been able to open up the actual coffee shop at Epiphany Church, but it is so special to watch these children and the way in which they're able to bring people to such deep joy.
Oh, she would be all about that.
Yeah,
she really
like making
would.
Cookies. And
that's our nightly routine.
Yeah, that's
Every
it.
night we make cookies.
Yeah, so we'll have to have her future employment there. So it'll be fun to do that. So let's just jump into a couple things here that I thought were striking about. I mean, with obviously there's a lot of areas that we can talk about with you, but one thing that strikes me is being a mother of 10, being a part of such a family that has such strong roots in Catholic formation. And I think that today it's easy to skirt by formation and just get to, are you getting A's or not? And then can you get into the college that you want to go to? And I feel like that doesn't do the formation process of young people proper thing. So it's not just, I want to do this club or this sport so I can get into this school or be able to study this so that I can get this job. We're talking about the whole human person. And we're talking about the development of not just their mind, but also their body, and not just their body, but also their soul. And ultimately, the goal in life is to get to heaven. And the way there is through Jesus. So talk in general, you mentioned it a little bit, but Catholic schools and the formation of children in the Catholic way, how would you describe that? What would be the benefits of that?
Wow, I am such a huge proponent. Let me just back up a little bit. Formation is something that happens whether you're aware of it or not.
Correct.
And as you're maturing as a child, you are being formed by the culture around you. Pope John Paul II described the relationship between people and culture as something that's slightly circular, in the sense that human beings can create and influence their culture, but in turn, the culture puts its own stamp on them. And we're seeing that now. I mean, we have a culture that is very aggressively secular. And I think there's no other way to put to describe it, where our children, especially as they go through school, unfortunately in public schools in particular, but outside of school time, with the influences they see in shows and media, the displacement of Sunday worship with sports, all of these things, it's the culture forming our children in a way that pulls them away from God and even pulls them away from the family. And so the benefit that I see of Catholic education is you put a child, you enroll a child in a school that is still going to teach all of the academic subjects. And our Catholic schools are tremendous in Pittsburgh in terms of offering a rigorous Catholic education and plenty of opportunities with sports and clubs and everything else. But at the same time, it's a formation that should be, properly understood, a school of virtue, right? So that from the moment they set foot in a Catholic school, there are expectations that they are going to be expected to conform their life to follow Jesus in all of these ways, even not just in terms of what they say in a religion class or how well they can answer questions, but in terms of how they treat other people, in terms of their responses to authority, in terms of how they approach a particular intellectual problem, in terms of how they understand general trends in the world or their response to here's an example. I know my kids are at Seton LaSalle, and for years, they've, the history class has taken a lot of time talking about the plight of the Uyghur Muslims in China, because we had a student from China who was a Uyghur Muslim. And so I remember being amazed a number of years ago when my kids first came home, and it was before this was even on the really prominent in the news, but my kids were suddenly talking about the religious oppression of the Uyghur Muslims in China. And I remember thinking, okay, there's some good things happening in that social studies class, right? So it wasn't in religion class, it was in social studies. So the goal of the Catholic school is to form a child at every moment, not just consciously, yes, but also subconsciously, so that every single moment in the Catholic school is going to be Christ-centered and centered towards developing the whole person.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really what I think is the tremendous gift. It was interesting. I was involved in some of the principal searches. And
Sure.
we would interview candidates who would come in who had never been in the Catholic school system, and you would say to them, "What does it mean to be a Catholic educator?" And they would say, "Well," and I give them full credit, because here they were coming from a secular system, and they said, "I want to be in a school where, I can talk about God and I can pray with my students." And you would hear that and you would say, "Well, yes, that's true, but that's not the whole thing, right? Like you're just scratching the surface."
Amen.
And here they were sort of, a friend of mine described it as they're outside looking in, they have their faces pressed up against the window, and they're thinking, "I want to be part of that, but I'm not in it, and so I don't fully understand it." And then as soon as, when you see these teachers brought in to a situation where they're in the Catholic school environment, you see in short order, it dawns on them what an amazing opportunity this is, and how you really are engaged in whole person formation. And the other thing that I think is vitally important, and should be more and more important to parents, I really encourage parents to think about this, is that the approach that Catholic schools take to the relationship with the parents is radically opposed to the role that public education takes to the relationship to the parents. The church teaches the parents are the primary educators of their children.
Correct.
Right?
Yes, that's fundamental.
That is not the case when your child walks through the door in a public school. The state controls their education. And there are Supreme Court cases out there saying, because there are cases where parents have petitioned for the right to be able to tailor their child's education. And with the exception of an opt-out for sex education, you cannot opt out of courses in your public school. You cannot tailor your child's education. The school may allow you to, but it is not a right. Right?
So what is the state taking the parents' role in formation mean? Like what type of formation are they actually imbuing? So if they're taking the role of parents, what are they doing?
Yeah, they are forming your child in secular humanism. I mean,
So what does that mean? Like for somebody, that's a wonderful word, secular humanism, but like concretely, kid going to a public school here, whether it be in the area that we live in, this great grouping, or anywhere in the country, what does that ultimately mean? What are they getting in these public schools?
Yeah, let me describe it.
Yeah.
Your child steps into a public school, and
Correct.
They step into a threshold where there is no visible or oral reminder that God even exists that is allowed, right? So you step into a place that has been wiped clean of any reference to God. Okay. That is how, unfortunately, the Supreme Court cases dating from the 1960s on have interpreted the First Amendment with respect to public education as taking a stance of agnosticism. And that is how your children are going to be raised. They're going to be raised to approach the intersection between faith and reason, coming back to that again, as if faith is a purely private matter that you only practice when you're at home. But when you're out in the public square, you have to enter into this stance of agnosticism, where you leave your faith in your locker or at the door, because you can't bring it into your classes, unfortunately. And in recent years, the Supreme Court has expanded its understanding of religious freedom, but unfortunately, school districts tend to be very litigation shy, and they tend to almost always react in a way where they squash even personal expressions of faith, right?
So when you walk into a public school and you're a baptized Christian, how do you take the Christianity out of the Christian?
I mean,
it seems like you'd be in an identity crisis almost, right?
I think so. I think our kids learn to compartmentalize their faith at a very early age. But now that depiction of what the public school is like from a faith and formation standpoint is maybe the most benign. Right. And I think, and I'm aware, I know 95% of our Catholic parents have their kids in public school. So I always get parents who hear this and who are very distressed. So I mention this not to indict parents or to blame them, because I understand. I've got a child with special needs. I understand there are times, when you, as a parent, you're making your the decision that this may be the place for the best place for your child, or it may be a matter of finances. Although I think as a church, we need to make sure nobody ever feels like financially they can't send a child to Catholic school.
Totally.
But now with the Equality Act, we're in a different terrain altogether, right? Because the Equality Act that is making its way through Congress now, and the executive order just signed yesterday by President Biden, insists that in public schools cannot discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, which means for all practical purpose, in every single public school has to allow biological males to play on a women's sports team. Every public school has to allow biological males to be able to use a girl's bathroom if he so desires, or a biological girl to use the men's restroom or the boys' bathroom if she desires, right? And parents can't complain about that. And so if your child doesn't want to share a locker room with a biological male, your child, who is making a request that 5 years ago would have been deemed normal, reasonable, the most reasonable stance to take, your child then has to go and use a separate segregated bathroom, which is, quickly going to be seen as the bathroom for people who are transphobic or bigoted, right? So now with the addition of the Equality Act, it's putting families and children in a terrible position. And it's still, it's not too late. Anyone who's listening now, you definitely need to call your senator, your congressman. Exactly. Because it isn't too late to try to stop this, especially I think the argument about women's sports tends to resonate with people.
Why would that resonate with you as a woman who played sports?
Oh, well, I was a cross country runner, right? And a track runner.
Okay.
And I was good. I was, one of the better ones in high school. And I was, ran varsity at Notre Dame. And so there were times when I would run in a high school race when I would beat one of the boys.
Sure.
But if you had put me in a race where I had to compete against biological male contestants competing in the women's race, I would never have won anything. There's no comparison. The achievement gap in terms of speed, strength, and all kinds of things is just you can't make up for it. And even someone who goes through a transition procedure, a medical transition, and starts taking hormones, they still have physiological advantages, right? So their body is capable. It is still going to be physiologically stronger, and it still is capable of operating in an anaerobic capacity longer than women can. Right? They have the strength factor is different. So even if you try to equalize it in terms of testosterone, there still is an advantage. So essentially what happens with allowing biological males to play women's sports, you're rolling back all the advances we've made with Title IX. And that is exactly what this administration is doing, because they've redefined sex to include gender identity, which then makes it meaningless, because Title IX is intended to provide protection for biological females so that they too can have sports, because the recognition is if women have to compete against men all the time, they'll never win, right? I mean, maybe one or two might win, but for the most part, my girls would have had no chance to succeed athletically. I would have had no chance. Right. And that means that not only goes to sports participation, but you lose scholarship opportunity. You lose, being able to play a sport and succeed in a sport is an incredible part of formation. It's made women more successful in the boardroom. It's made women more successful in various walks of life, because you learn skills through competition. And so to deprive young women of that is, to me, just such a tragic step backwards for our country.
What do you think that does to the actual formation of an adolescent when they have this type of, let's say, bathroom discussion, and guys going into the girls' room, girls going into the guys' room, and what does that do to their identity and formation when they're being so encouraged to be able to redefine themselves at different stages of development, knowing that they were blessed with a dignity unto themselves that can't be simply reassigned through a medical procedure.
Yeah. Well, one of my, a friend of mine wrote one of the briefs in the Harris Funeral Home case that unfortunately, was decided, I think, in the wrong direction.
Sure.
But in her brief, her name is Margaret McCarthy, and she's a professor at the John Paul II Institute. As part of her brief that she helped to co-author, she made the point that once you accept the transgender premise, then all of us, by describing everyone as cisgender, all of us, in a sense, are transgender, in the sense that if there is the possibility that someone's body and their gender identity don't align, their sexual identity don't align, if that's possible for one person, it's possible for everyone, right? And so what it does to an adolescent is it teaches them to question the reality of who they are, right? And we see this increasingly, especially with young girls. There's a social contagion element to gender confusion, where you see, and this is documented, especially in the UK, the Tavistock Clinic, because it's socialized medicine, kept extensive records. You will see in friend groups, you will see clusters of girls transitioning together, where you have young women, especially, who for various reasons may be uncomfortable with their bodies. Maybe they've absorbed some of the cultural misogyny. Maybe they're being sexually harassed. Maybe some of them have been sexually abused. Right. Some young women are on the autistic spectrum. Yeah. There can be a whole host of reasons why a child might feel discomfort. Their body's changing, right? Sure. And as they're experiencing distress over the changes of their body, and they're going through kind of adolescent, trying to figure out who they are, their culture is telling them, you might not be who you think you are. Maybe you actually are a boy. And so what that does, I think, is it puts intense pressure on our young people to conform to stereotypes. Because if you don't conform to those stereotypes about who's a girl and who's a boy, our culture is saying, well, you might actually be transgender, right? So the girl with atypical interests who might grow up to be married and be an engineer, or be, whatever, maybe like just a tomboy. I wore pants much of my childhood. It was like, whatever, you wore whatever you could, actually, whatever was clean.
Family of 10, you're happy to get the right sock on the right foot, right?
That's exactly right. I played with the boys. Yeah. I did sports my whole life. It was never a question, because it was okay to be a girl who liked sports. Right. And it was okay to be a girl who liked to build things. And it was okay to be a girl who liked math class or liked philosophy. There aren't that many women in the field of philosophy, or at least there weren't when I was going through. And that was okay, because it was understood that you're a person and you have unique gifts and talents, right? But now what we're doing is we're putting kids in boxes almost, so that if they express an atypical interest, it suddenly calls into question their very identity. And it really is so damaging. And for the kids who are confident about who they are, they still have to conform, because in their school now, the children who say that they identify as transgender, all of the other kids have to honor the pronoun requests, and all of the other kids have to honor the name change. And everyone has to buy into the idea that so-and-so was a boy, but now is a girl. So-and-so was a girl, but now is a boy. Right. And they're making an ontological claim that as a culture, we're all required to sign on to.
Let's just take a deeper dive into the human person. You have a resource that you started, which you would describe, and I think it was, the website has a very good description of Person and Identity Project that can help for parents, for teachers, schools, for parishes, for churches. And talk a little about person and identity, and why you feel like this project can really help have a healthy dialogue, and also inspire us to recognize how rooted we are in God the Father, and how we've been given that image and likeness of God.
Sure. Well, just to take a step back,
please.
When you look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and you read what the Catechism of the Catholic Church has to say, the phrase the Catechism uses is sexual identity.
Correct.
Which I think is a terrific, it is, I mean, obviously, I'm not questioning the Catechism. I wouldn't question the Catechism even if I didn't like the phrase. But it is a particularly good descriptor because it captures the unity of body and soul, right? So one of the things you see with the rise of gender confusion and
Oh, well, there goes the call St. Matthew.
I know. One of the things you see when people become confused about their identity, whether or not they're biologically male or female, and claim a gender identity that's at odds with it, is you see a bifurcation between the body and the soul. And there's a sense that who you are is your soul and your spirit and your desires, the sum of all your desires. And then your body becomes this thing that might be mismatched and that you can surgically or medically alter to express to the world who you now believe you are, right? So if you think about it in that way, as a culture, we have essentially split the person into, in a way that relegates the body to just being a meaningless canvas for us to project our desires and our identity on, right? And that goes against everything the Catholic Church teaches about the unity of the person, right? So here the Catholic Church, which, over the years has been so maligned about being, repressive and not having a healthy handle on human sexuality. We're the defenders of the beauty of the human body and the beauty of human sexuality. So your identity as a person is you, body and soul, unity of the person, right? And there's a philosopher, Father Norris Clark, who wrote a book, The One and the Many, and he has a short description of how we understand being male or female. And his point is, everyone has a human soul. God creates you with your soul in your particular body. And the experiences you have in your body, male or female, are going to be what makes you a unique and special person as a man or as a woman, right? So there's no getting away from being either male or female. So what we're trying to do, getting back to the website, what we've found over the last several years, I've been going out and I've been speaking to different parish groups and schools and dioceses about the website. And we found there is a tremendous confusion about how to even approach the topic among Catholics. And so our goal with this is to provide resources. The website is free. You can access things for free. So we're trying to provide resources for families, for schools, for parishes, to help you understand what's going on with the gender craze that's sweeping our country, and to help you understand what our church teaches and why it's so beautiful and why it's so important. And with that in mind, the goal is to help equip people to be able to answer the questions that children are going to have, and to be able to help our children resist this very toxic culture that's being pushed on them.
When you talk like that, like equipping parents, and you're equipping schools, and obviously you're equipping me as a priest to be able to do that, what type of feedback have you gotten from people as you've started into this and trying to help them? What are some of the common confusions or points? I find I get calls all the time of, families, my brother is going to have a marriage with another man, and how do I deal with that in the family? Or just the other day, a dear mom was saying that her second grader was told by the teacher that he's getting married to another guy, and it's a public school, and now they're in second grade, and he comes home saying, what does that mean to marry a man, and you're a man? And so what's the feedback you've received in terms of trying to be a resource of truth in the world that seems to be so full of lies and identity crisis?
Right. Well, the first thing you have to do, I think, is to reassure our faithful, our Catholic, faithful Catholics who are trying to understand what the church teaches and why, reassure them that the church's teaching is mercy. It is compassionate, right? And a lot of times I find especially with issues like with the transgender issue, one of the most effective ways to break through to people is to walk them through exactly what a gender transition might look like, and let them see that there's medical harm that takes place. When you pump a person full of cross-sex hormones or puberty blockers, I mean, you think about all the litigation out there for Lupron for people who went through precocious puberty, and think about the fact that now doctors are using that off-label on children who are very vulnerable and using it in an experimental way at high doses, right? So you think about that, and you can demonstrate to people, hey, this isn't benign. This is a really harsh procedure that does violence to the human body. So let's think about that, right? A mastectomy, you know, I've had friends who have had breast cancer and who have had to have a mastectomy.
Right.
And there's trauma involved in that, right? That is a traumatic experience. And you do it because you understand there is a disease and you need to cure it, right? But when you think about the fact that, I mean, if you go on GoFundMe, you can pull up hundreds of, you know, like tens of thousands of pages of GoFundMe pages set up by young adolescent girls trying to fund their mastectomies. And maybe at that point, shouldn't we as a culture be looking at it saying, what is going on with our girls? Why do they feel so vulnerable? And why do they feel like they need to alter themselves in order to feel safe?
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So the first thing I think with our Catholics is to break through the narrative of compassion that surrounds the secular take on things, and to reassure people that what the church has to offer, the teachings of Christ, are always merciful and are most compassionate. Right? Sometimes I think we need to take a step back and to talk about moral theology and be able to talk about the distinction between an action and how we would evaluate the morality of an action and someone's culpability, right?
Yes.
So we can talk about this and we can acknowledge these are vulnerable people who may be led to do something that is going to be self-destructive,
Right.
but not condemn them as a bad person.
Correct.
To recognize this is someone who is vulnerable and who is being led into doing something that is harmful to them, right? And then also, so that would be another piece of the
And even
puzzle.
in that piece, I think it's so important to realize that so many people are doing it out of weakness, not out of malice. And so there could be a lot of psychological confusion, there could be emotional, there could just be a lot of atmosphere things that are just very hard in their daily life.
Yes.
And so there could be more weakness out than malice. And I think also Jesus Christ's death on the cross, the blood on the cross, is what saves all humanity, not some transgender operation that can get us to another euphoria. It's the salvation of Jesus Christ. And so he reveals to humanity how to be a human being.
Yes.
And it's rooted so much in the relationship with God the Father, who has created us in his image and likeness. I always think about like Sidney Crosby, you know, he's wearing a jersey that's 87. And what does he do? He plays hockey. But who is he? He's a 5'11" man who weighs 200 pounds from Nova Scotia. But whose is he? He's not possession of the Pittsburgh Penguins. He works for them. But whose is he? He's a child of God. He's the son of the Father. And so, yes, he has obviously a identity in what he does and who he is, but whose he is at the depth of it all is he was knitted wonderfully in his mother's womb. And I think sometimes we can separate the two things of seeing him just as a possession of the Penguins, but he's not. He's actually a human being. He's a person that can resonate deeper. So when he had a concussion, you don't say his brain just got hurt. Sidney Crosby got hurt.
Yes.
Like on injured reserve was not his brain and then his was floating around. No, it was Sidney Crosby who's placed on injured reserve. It's him as a person. Right.
Right. And we're missing that in our culture. We really are missing that. But I think also the secular mindset in our culture, and you know, keep in mind our kids are being formed in this 24/7.
Correct.
Leads to them not really, children in particular, not really understanding the relationship of the body and the soul, right? And if we're not actively forming them and driving home this relationship between the body and the soul, the importance of things like the theology of the body, the fact that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. We don't use that language anymore, do we?
No.
Right? And that's,
It's true.
I grew up learning that's why you don't commit sins,
Right.
because your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. But maybe we need to go back even more basic and say, your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, and that's why you need to take care of it. And why you need to love it because God loves it, right? Like, you are valuable and worthwhile in the eyes of God. Yeah. Made in his image and likeness. And one of the things we hear from families who have children going through this, in particular, is that this is truly an identity crisis.
Correct.
And it is an identity crisis. This is not a case of a mismatched brain or a physiological issue. This is a psychological issue that these children are experiencing that is being treated in a medical and surgical fashion. And even something like a social transition, which is presented as benign, is not benign, because 98, 99, 100% of those kids, depending on the study, go on to transition medically or surgically.
Wow.
Because it's an identity issue.
Right.
And so I was just reading yesterday, the protocol in the United States is modeled on a protocol from the Netherlands from the early 2000s. Right. And the author of the study that outlined the protocol, a doctor named Steensma, gave an interview recently where he said, our research was not on young adolescents. Like, what's going on now is not anything we researched. And if you look at even in the UK, in the Tavistock Clinic, very, very publicly had to take a step back and take a step back from the way it was processing all of these children through, because there was a court case that came through where the High Court in the UK found that they were medically and surgically transitioning children who were incapable of giving consent.
Right. That's why I wonder where the freedom is. Like, to do a human act, you have to be free.
You have to be free. But unfortunately,
and that consciousness isn't there for a 5-year-old.
Right. But unfortunately, and, again, this is sort of bad news for parents. There's a whole host of things that are bracketed off by law where we make mature minor exceptions. Abortions, for example.
Correct.
Your 11-year-old could get an abortion.
Right.
And so increasingly, gender transitions are going to be put in that bucket.
Right.
Right. And so this becomes an issue of parental rights. So if, for example, your child goes to a school counselor at your public school, your school counselor now is obligated by law to honor that child's request for a new name and new pronouns, but is also obligated, and if you pull the policies from the
propaganda,
Pittsburgh Public Schools, for example, they will not let the family know unless the child lets them.
Right.
Right? So your child may be well on the way to transition before you're even notified. And so again, that gets back to that issue of parents' rights.
Right. And to me, it gets back to the basic responsibility that that we started from the beginning, that your parents instilled in you, and then you're with your children. And I can't imagine any parents watching this, or grandparents, not wanting to take responsibility for the formation of their children, but maybe not realizing that in the end, the public school philosophy is that they're the parents.
Yes.
And so they're substituting you.
Right. Well, the other problem that we face, and I think this is a problem we need to take very seriously as a church, is that if you think about if you have a child who's in public school, and you think about the number of hours your child spends in public school versus the number of hours in CCD or religious education, you might get 1 week's worth of religious education, and then compared to whatever it is, like 40, 50 weeks of public school education. So if you just do it on the math, assuming this is a child who makes every single CCD class, you're still only 1 week out of a whole entire school year. And there's a huge imbalance in terms of time. And that's not to blame parents. It's just to say, as a church, I don't think we've grappled with the reality of what we're up against, because this is a formation. It used to be, my mother was a public school student, and she always used to tell us about what it was like going to the public schools. It was the public school system, for all intents and purposes, was a Protestant school system, but it was Christian, right?
Sure.
So you would go through with your Christian faith intact, right? But that's not the case anymore, right? No. So it's different from the public school that my generation went through and that my mother's generation went through. This is a public school that is actively pushing its own ideology. And
Right.
you know, families who have had children go through the whole transgender experience describe it as a cult, really, because their kids will go online, they'll research, they'll find the magic words to say to get testosterone. You can go to Planned Parenthood and get testosterone on the first visit if you're a young girl. You know, there's all kinds of groupthink that takes place. There's a whole host of online cheerleaders. It isolates you from your family. You become withdrawn. I mean, there's a lot of aspects of this that I think are very troubling, just from a, you know, even aside from the gender transition, but in terms of separating a child from their family.
Right.
So, and you know, again, you know, I've over the years, as we've been speaking in 2015 or 2016, when I would talk about this issue, it was all theory for people.
Right.
Now, when I give a talk on it, I always have parents coming up and asking me questions whose own children are struggling with this.
Yeah.
Every single time. And these are, if you could see some of these families, these are tremendous mothers and fathers,
Yeah.
right? So we make a mistake if we think that this only happens to troubled kids,
Right.
because this can happen to any vulnerable child
Correct.
who is, you know, going through an identity crisis and is, you know, ushered down a road of being first. And it always seems to start with going through the Gay Straight Alliance and becoming sympathetic and swept up in the LGBT issues at the public school. And then they go from there into assuming, well, maybe I'm transgender because I'm not like everyone else.
Right, right. And what recommendations would you give to a priest, a pastor, a church? I think you have some resources on your website, but and you obviously have a brother-in-law who's a priest. How can we help our families? I mean, I think about you with your children. I am sure that all of us know people, come in contact with your children, and people who are struggling with that. But as a parish community, what would you recommend? What would be some things that you would recommend for me or for our parishes?
Well, I think the first thing that strikes me is that when a family goes through this, there's an incredible sense of shame.
Sure.
And that's unfortunate, because
It is.
as I mentioned, I some of the families I've met these are tremendous. These are devoted parents. These are, you know, stay-at-home mothers, involved fathers. Their
Right.
children, for whatever reason, you know, may have gotten swept up. Sometimes it's kids who do have, you know, a troubled family background, and those are families in need of support too.
Sure.
So the first thing I would say is, as a parish, you need to make sure that you are approachable, so that a family can come to you and say this, and maybe confide in you. Parents can confide in you. A child can confide that they wonder about this, and they will not be met with judgment, but they will be met with love and compassion to say, you know what, let's have the conversation. Let's talk. I hear you. I'm listening to you. You know, what wonderful concerned parents you are for raising this issue.
Yeah, I know for me, it's probably a little deeper than you probably wanted to go with what you're saying, but one of the challenges that I feel, I will obviously would do anything to help families and to be as open as I could. But yet I've also felt in the priesthood the influence of homosexual priests and how they've deviantly really put the church in really compromising positions with the youth and with the young people.
Yes.
And so there's like this sense of, okay, there's obviously people who are truly struggling with the roots of their identity, but at the same time, some of those men have become priests and have really put a barrier between me and families. And so as a priest, it's a really hard challenge to try to do what you're saying. And I'm not saying it's not worth trying to do, but do you understand what I mean?
Oh no, absolutely. It's hard on a number of different levels. Number one, there is now this barrier between priests and young people for ministry.
Yeah.
There just is. And there's in a sense a hermeneutic of suspicion that people approach Catholic priests with because of the scandals. And it's incredibly harmful. I would also say, I think the other side of this that maybe we, you know, again, to go deep here, is that because of the existence of, you know, homosexuality in the priesthood over the years, not just the scandals, because the scandals are priests with minors, but just homosexual priests.
Right. Living
church-
lifestyles like that. Yeah.
Yeah, the church has been silent on this issue.
Correct.
And you can't. Right now, we're trying to talk about the transgender issue.
Correct.
On its own, as its own separate thing.
Right.
But you can't talk about that with also catechizing on same-sex attraction and how to understand human sexuality, because this is a question of sexual identity.
Correct.
And you need to understand yourself as male or female.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
So we have really put ourselves in a really damaging, we've really set ourselves back. And we've set ourselves back because of the lack of holiness of the priesthood. And I will say also, and it isn't always appropriate to bring up these issues from the pulpit, right? So you need to make sure, you almost need to pre-catechize your people before you can catechize them from, in terms of homilies. But there is also a real reluctance on the part of the priesthood, of the priests I know, to talk about any of these controversial issues. And I don't know if it's just because they may feel like the diocese won't back them up.
Yeah, that could be true. I think for me, I gave a very strong homily on this issue in November, and I wonder if I was more speaking from the anger that I feel because one of my best friends committed suicide after being abused by a priest when I was growing up. And I wonder if that also is speaking in me. And I know I have to do a lot more transformation in Jesus to be able to truly try to minister and pastor to our families that are struggling with this. So it's definitely something that is a huge challenge. But for me, one of the things that has freed me so much in being able to speak or to pray or to at least try my best and trying to understand whether it be transgender, gay, or just even my own sexuality was St. John Paul II's teaching of the theology of the body, where, I don't know, maybe it was just the culture that I lived in when I grew up or where we are now, but sex was always this kind of dark thing that was for movies and pornography and this and that. And it wasn't always something that I experienced or understood as a gift. And when we realize, like, where does our sexuality come from? It comes from the heart of our Father, who created us. And then he, through Jesus, reveals to us the truth and how to be a human being. And
it still is that
yes,
way
it hasn't
in our
changed.
culture.
Yeah.
It still is that way.
Okay,
where we have such a very dark view of human sexuality.
Right. Yes.
It really truly is the culture of death, and you can see it very vividly in the declining birth rate.
Correct.
I mean, we are a culture that is exhausted, that doesn't understand family life and the importance of the family. It has nothing to live for. Right. So you see young people who are afraid of, looking for commitment, looking for meaning in their life. And what do we give them? We give them, advice from the Pennsylvania Secretary of Health on, how to handle a pandemic by yourself. I'm not even going to go into the advice, but the advice we're giving them it isn't advice that helps you to live a virtuous life as a human being. And it's not advice that is going to help you to live a life of sacrifice and responsibility, which is how you're going to become the person God wants you to be.
Right. And in the end, the goal of life is to get to heaven. And it's through the love of Christ. And it's by experiencing love through the way our Creator has blessed us in that. And there's that phrase out there where love is love. No, God is love. And so when we reduce the climax and the glory of the human person down to some sexual act only, we've completely lost the fullness of who we are as a human person. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. And we've, as a culture, not to get back into philosophy, but as a culture, because of the split between body and soul, right? If you think your body means nothing, right? Which I would say, like, what laid the groundwork for people accepting that was contraception in the 1960s, where it was like, we don't have to deal with getting pregnant if we don't want to, right? We can manipulate the body and make it do what we want.
And we can separate the act of sex from the thought of maybe a commitment, which is a total lie, because biologically you might be saying, yes, I'm committed to, but philosophically you might even not know this person. It might be just a hookup. You don't know what you're going to do economically, geographically, you're not on the same ability, maybe spiritually you're not, and legally you're not. But biological, yes, with all these no's, that's living love in a lie.
Yes. But once we did that, right?
Right.
If you look at how the Supreme Court defined marriage in the Obergefell and the
Right.
Windsor decisions, they define marriage as a relationship for the sake of companionship, to make you happy, right? So
could I marry my cat under that?
Yes, actually. I mean,
Philomena, she's passed, but I feel like we have a companionship.
John Roberts, who I think is not even, the most rigorous thinker on the Supreme Court.
That's to put it mildly.
Don't get me started on
yeah.
But he, his decision dissenting on marriage, he pointed out that it's a much farther stretch to redefine marriage as being, between same-sex individuals rather than being an opposite-sex institution than it is to envision marriage between multiple people, right? And there was just a story the other day of 3 dads and their baby, right?
Sure.
That they had paid a surrogate. So here they are exploiting a poor woman to carry a baby, even though that poses tremendous risks for women, right? So that they can then have 3 dads on the birth certificate, and then they would all have legal say over that child. How far we've come. But look at what we're doing. We are reducing the human person to desire, right?
Correct.
So that your desires are now your identity, which then brings us back full circle to what we're teaching our children.
Right.
And so that's all they know. That's all they're being given. And it's so impoverished, and it's a lie, because you've got to be able to, if you can't live in that integrity of body and soul.
Yeah. And that's what I think St. John Paul II brought with Theology of the Body, of recognizing that we've been given such a great gift. And when we take that responsibility of what we've been blessed with and identify, it's so beautiful to be able to just live that out. And I just wanted to end with a thought on chastity, because I think there is something to be said about the proper ordering of creation towards what God's purpose of it was. So, for example, animals, they were properly given to us so that we could be stewards of them. So the proper ordering of animals is towards the end of our creation, which is a beautiful thing to do. But then our sexuality is also part of creation. And the proper ordering of our sexuality is according to the vocation that we've been called to. So as a priest, what a blessing it is to be able to live a celibate life, because I know that the proper ordering of my sexuality as a man is to be given to the Father by loving Mary, by loving the church, but not having a wife to be able to have a family. It doesn't make it easy. It's not easy for me. I struggle. It's hard to be able to look at women and see how beautiful they are and not want to have that pleasure with them. But it also is a recognition of such a gift and a blessing that God created me knowing that I can be fulfilled as a priest. And then, I look at my brothers and sisters, look at you, and look at so many married people and realize that the proper ordering of their body and their sexuality is towards marriage.
Right.
And so everybody has to have the challenge, no matter what they feel inside about their sexuality, towards ordering it properly towards the mission of what God has created them in.
Right. And I can remember, even from my days working with different catechetical programs, 20 years ago, one of the ways we would talk about chastity is as the virtue that frees love from selfishness, right? So even if you're married, you may have, if you're say you're married and you're a husband or a wife whose spouse has dementia and cognitively is, maybe is bedridden or infirm, you're still bound to live your vows of chastity and to be faithful to your spouse, even though you can no longer have those kinds of conjugal privileges. So we've sort of put ourselves in a situation as a culture where we view the denial of engaging in sexual activity as like a great loss and a great harm, rather than recognizing that sometimes there may be situations where this is where you go beyond just ordinary love and you go into that transcendent sacrificial love where we really see the love that God has for each other. And there is nothing more beautiful when you see those images of, say an elderly couple and, one is caring for the other who's wheelchair bound or bedridden. I mean, it strikes all of us. We all are moved by that. And there's a reason for it. It's because there we see the love of the Father.
Well, thank you. I know we went well beyond our time, but again, I think that for me, as I contemplate this, I just am so grateful to how God has created us wonderfully, and it's in identifying and really allowing His wisdom, His love in us, and receiving that that can truly be the fulfillment of every deepest desire that we have. And so I'm very grateful for you coming on the program today. Our next program will be next week with my sister-in-law, Regina Dunhu, and Amy Shearing, and we'll be talking about the Woman's Choice Network to really see what are the options for women. Is it only to go to Planned Parenthood when you're pregnant? Are there other options to be able to explore and to really see some of the refreshing ways in which women and men are coming together to try to cherish life at all stages, the way you obviously did with your dear husband, Mike, and find in all of your children such an expression of the Father's love for you both. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Letting our Blessed Mother have the last word in the Memorare. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that ever was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thy intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, I fly unto thee, O Virgin of Virgins, my Mother. To thee do I come, before thee I stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not my petitions, but in thy mercy hear and answer me. Amen.
Amen.